Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Jage, and I'm the Child Sexual Violence Researcher for the Child Sexual Violence Research Initiative, SVRI. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to our fourth webinar in our new virtual series, which is the Voices from SVRI Forum 2024, Strengthening the Field Through Shared Learning. This series is made possible through co-funding from the Australian Volunteers Program, and we are deeply grateful for your partnership with the SVRI and for your continued commitment to advancing learning and field building. Over the past few months, we've unpacked key findings from the SVRI Forum 2024, most recently exploring intimate partner violence. If you missed any of these sessions, recordings are available on the forum website, and Lisa will drop the link in the chat shortly. So in today's session, we'll continue our learning journey by exploring the intersections of climate change and violence against women and children, VAW and VAC. We'll hear research findings from Samoa, from Southern Africa, Colombia, Nigeria, and the Philippines, highlighting how climate shocks such as droughts, floods, and resource-related conflicts exacerbate the risks of violence against women and violence against children. So just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's session will run for 1 hour, and all the sessions will be recorded and will be publicly shared on SVRI's and the AVP's platforms. The audience is muted, but we'd love for you to introduce yourselves. So please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Please let us know your name and where you're joining us from. We welcome your questions and reflections throughout, so feel free to please use the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll do our best to bring as many of our questions into the conversation as time allows. So just a quick look at the agenda. We'll begin with an overview of climate change and VAW-related findings from the SVRI Forum 2024. And this will be followed by presentations from our three speakers who I'll introduce as the panel session begins. We'll then move into a live Q&A with your questions. And finally, we'll close with the next steps. So before we begin the conversation, I'd like to invite Liz Dartnell. Liz is the Executive Director of the SVRI, and she's going to share a high-level overview of forum findings related to climate change and VAW-related findings at the SVRI Forum 2024. Liz, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you again to our AVP colleagues for partnering with us on this series. And thank you everyone for joining us today for this discussion on climate and gender-based violence, a really super important topic. Next slide, please, Liesl. Just to remind everybody about SVRI Forum, about the size and the reach of the conference, which brought together over 1,500 people from over 112 countries to Cape Town, to share evidence, to deepen our collaborations, create new ones, and really discuss what we need to do to end violence against women and violence against children globally. And we really cannot wait to see you at the next one. So this session, as Joanne has spoken about, is really talking about what did we learn around climate change and gender-based violence at the forum. Next slide, please, Liesl. But first I thought it would be really helpful just to frame this conversation, grounding us with a reflection on the moment we are living in. I think it would be important to remind us, I know that we all know deeply and intensely, that we are living through a time of converging crises, climate breakdown, deepening inequality, shrinking civic space, and a breaking down of democracy all around the world, all of which I think are reinforcing and intensifying existing injustices, especially for women, girls, and marginalized communities. And as Philip Alston spoke about in 2019, I believe, a previous UN rapporteur, he spoke about that the climate crisis is no longer just about melting glaciers or rising seas. It is now a direct threat to peace, democracy, and human rights. And around the world, we're seeing governments respond to this crisis, not with the action that we would like and hope for, but with repression. Protest is being criminalized. We're seeing civic space shrinking and resistance being punished. And again, those with the least power to respond are bearing the brunt, facing both the accelerating impacts of climate change and increasing repression when they try to resist. So I want to talk a little bit about where research fits in with this. At the SVRI, we see research not just as producing evidence, but as a form of mobilization. It can be and is a powerful tool for activists, practitioners, and other researchers and funders to challenge the status quo and drive systemic change. For example, in Uganda, researchers funded by UNDP discovered that climate change programs were unintentionally increasing gender-based violence. And with this research, they partnered with a local organization called SVRI in Uganda to integrate violence prevention into climate programming. We know that climate justice and gender justice are interconnected, and in Uganda, we have to be using our research to help bridge this gap. Next slide, please, Liesl. But the research is clear. We as researchers are really only just catching up now with what communities have known for a very long time, that climate disasters is intensifying gender-based violence. Across the world, when floods, droughts, cyclones hit, we are seeing spikes in domestic violence, sexual exploitation, and other forms of gender-based violence. And these are not isolated events. They are following a clear pattern. And as the panelists are going to be talking about, these mechanisms are very well documented. For example, when crops fail due to drought, families face economic stress that can trigger violence. We know that when communities are displaced, existing protection systems are breaking down. When food becomes scarce, survival strategies often put women and girls at increased risk. Forum participants shared powerful findings showing how climate-related instability is driving violence against girls. We're going to hear more about this today. A study across 5 African countries shared at the forum found that compared with boys, girls living in drought settings are 30% more at risk for sexual violence. We also heard at the forum that during heat waves, femicide rates are increasing, and we've seen that in other studies globally. And this is not a future threat. It is happening now, and it is accelerating. Many traditional IPV prevention models still overlook these climate-related drivers, and we are applying outdated tools to a rapidly evolving crisis. So the message is that our prevention strategies have to evolve. We have to be integrating climate realities into our early warning systems, social protection systems, and economic empowerment programs. GBV expertise must be embedded across all climate adaptation and disaster response efforts. If we do not do this, we leave women, girls, and marginalized communities exposed in every climate emergency. So next slide, please, Liesl. So what does this mean for research? Similarly, there's increasing recognition that we need ethical, impactful research, especially in crisis-affected and under-resourced contexts, to help respond to gender-based violence during times of crisis, and where possible, to prevent it. To achieve this, our research has to be priority-led, grounded in the needs and realities of communities, practitioners, and policy makers. It needs to be survivor and community-centered, ensuring dignity, care, and relevance for our participants, and ethical and rigorous. We need to avoid duplication, minimizing harm, and upholding quality, and ensuring that people that we are working to serve trust us to hold their data sensitively and respect them when they're giving us the knowledge that we need to improve services and prevent violence in these settings. And we need action-oriented research, generating knowledge that leads to concrete change. Too often we're hearing stories of research in humanitarian settings being done repeatedly, the same communities being asked the same questions by different researchers. We need a much more coordinated response, and we know that findings rarely find their way back to the communities from which it's being gathered. And we don't know whether the reports based on these data is being useful or how it's being used. And so we have to move away from this approach towards that research that builds trust and shares power and really contributes meaningfully to solutions. But there is really good news. Better approaches are already being used, and we're going to hear more about them in this panel. But I want to highlight one that was shared at the forum, the Adonis Masati project in South Africa. Instead of bringing in external researchers to study refugee communities, they trained 27 community leaders to lead the research themselves. These leaders with the community identified gaps, documented needs, and linked people to services. It really truly was a research study done by the community for the community. And this is the shift we need from fragmented research that takes from communities towards more community-driven coordinated research that builds power and creates real solutions. Next slide, please. And we also need research that's driven by priorities that have been identified by the field for the field. So I have been through some of the priority setting research that SVRI has been involved with, as well as other priority setting work that's been done. But it's important to start by saying that these priorities listed on this slide are not research priorities by SVRI. These are priorities that were developed by the field for the field through very participatory, inclusive, and time-intensive processes involving researchers, practitioners, policymakers, donors, and survivors, those people that are often not allowed or enabled to be part of these processes across regions and sectors. So what you see in this slide brings together priority areas from across all agendas, from the global shared research agenda to the Africa shared research agenda, to agendas on tech-facilitated gender-based violence and agendas on conflict and crisis-related sexual violence. And I have pulled out research questions focusing on humanitarian and climate-affected settings from these agendas. So let me start with some of the priorities identified on climate-related research priorities. The research priority questions included understanding how climate-related stresses such as drought, displacement, and food insecurity increase risk and violence against women and violence against children. We also need research that helps us develop and evaluate integrated models that combine GB prevention with the climate adaptation strategies, as well as research that helps us identify effective ways to embed GBV expertise into early warning systems, disaster response, and social protection programming. And looking more broadly, the field has helped us identify additional research priorities that are highly relevant to humanitarian and crisis-affected settings. For example, violence in crisis, we really need research with a focus on conflict displacement and post-conflict recovery, including research on understudied groups, such as male survivors and children born of rape. In terms of tech-facilitated GBV in emergencies, there's a clear need for survivor-led decolonial research that helps inform digital policies, protections, and accountability mechanisms. And research on integrated response, especially in fragile contexts where these forms of violence co-occur and need to be addressed together. And finally, some cross-cutting priorities that underpin all effective research: ethical practice, methodological rigor, policy relevance, inclusivity, and investment in stronger local data systems for real-time decision-making. These are field-driven priorities, not abstract ideas. And our role, the SVRI roles, is to help advance them by supporting ethical, inclusive, impact-focused research reflects what the field says matters most. So some final thoughts. Next slide, please. What we're learning from the forum and elsewhere is that we can no longer afford to treat climate crisis, gender-based violence, and social injustice as separate challenges. These are interconnected crises, and they demand integrated, priority-driven responses. And the evidence is clear. When programs combine climate resilience and GB prevention, we are delivering stronger, more sustainable outcomes rather than siloed interventions. And we have to prioritize feminist, community-led, priority-driven research and action. We have to prioritize cross-sector collaboration. We can no longer be working in silos. No one organization can address this issue on our own. And we need locally grounded solutions that build power and not dependency. Our role as researchers, funders, and practitioners is to generate and support evidence that drives policy change, advocacy, and real-world impacts. So the bottom line, addressing climate change without tackling gender-based violence isn't ineffective only, it's unjust. We have the knowledge, the models, and the momentum. What we need now is bold investment, political will, and collective commitment to scale this work. Thank you. And Liesl has put together such an excellent panel that brings these ideas to life, and you'll hear more from these 3 studies that reflect everything that I've just talked about: intersectional, community-led research in action. But first, I'm going to hand back to Liesl to say a few words about Forum 26. Over to you, Liesl.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you so much for grounding us in the powerful findings from SVRI Forum 2024. I'm adding some links and I'm going to speak to them now. So before we move to today's panel, I'm excited to share that SVRI Forum 2026 is coming. We'll be gathering from 5 to 9 October 2026 at the Sintara Grand Hotel and Convention Center in Bangkok, Thailand, a venue chosen for its flexibility, accessibility, and heart at the center of Bangkok. This will truly be a global moment, bringing together researchers, practitioners, activists, survivors, policymakers, donors, and new voices from across the world to connect, share, and learn. We've already received over 100 workshop proposals, and our Young Professionals program is still open. You can find the link in the chat. Abstract submissions and registration will open on the 4th of August 2025, so please do stay tuned via SVRI's website and our social media. We can't wait to welcome you to Bangkok. And Joanne, over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Liesl. So as we've been sharing, we have an exciting panel of 3 speakers, and I'll go straight into introducing Dr. Genevieve Manel, who is a professor of social science and global health at UCL and a community health psychologist. Genevieve is currently leading a UKRA Future Leaders Fellowship focusing on gender-based violence prevention, and she has over 75 peer-reviewed publications, and she brings over 15 years of research experience across Samoa, Bangladesh, South Africa, and beyond, focusing on GBV, climate change, migration, and mental health. Welcome, Genevieve. Next, we have Dr. Botheina Estigani, who is a medical doctor and a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford's Department of Social Policy and Intervention, and her work investigates how climate change, particularly drought, affects the risk of violence against children and adolescents in Southern Africa. Botheina also leads spatial analysis on violence and adolescent sexual health risks with the Accelerate Hub. And lastly, we have Dr. Laura Forsyth, who is an associate professor at the University of Greenwich, where she leads the Gender and Social Difference Research Group. Laura has an interdisciplinary participatory background, which focuses on gender, food systems, environmental justice, particularly GBV in relation to food, climate, and nature. She has also led research across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and was the lead writer for the VAW Award Women in Agri-Food Systems in Sub-Saharan Africa report. So we'll begin with Dr. Genevieve Manel, and over to you, Genevieve. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk today about some research we've been doing on associations between natural hazards specifically and violence against women as part of a broader project looking at violence against women prevention in the world's highest prevalent settings. So I've lived in Samoa in the Pacific Ocean for the last 3 years, a region that's really feeling the effects of climate change on a daily basis. I went to Oceania first and foremost to study violence against women, but more and more, I feel that this is really being driven by climate change. So as such, we need research to fill gaps in what we know. And towards this goal, I'm going to present both a global analysis of secondary data and a country-specific analysis from Samoa. So next slide, please. So there's really increasing interest in this area, as everyone has said this morning, but actually there's not much research or conceptual mapping of the gender and violence nexus. And so we know an increasing amount about some climate change impacts, such as heat waves and severe storms, and the way these drive people into shelters, which increase the risk of violence. But we don't know very much yet about the direct pathways or indirect pathways between some of the slower, longer-term impacts of climate change on violence. So for example, what's the role of ocean acidification and biodiversity loss on damaging the infrastructure of communities and reducing their ability to mitigate rising rates of violence? And so today, I'm going to focus on the evidence linking natural hazards to intimate partner violence, but I just want to say that this is a nexus that is very vast and relatively unexplored, and that we need far more research in this area. Next slide, please. So there's been a number of systematic reviews done recently, 5 at my last count in the last 4 years, so since 2021. And in general, most of these reviews really point to the low quality or insufficient nature of quantitative data on associations between climate change and violence against women. Some of the reviews do, however, try to synthesize the data to develop better understandings of key pathways. So this is one of those really good reviews by Thurston and colleagues that map 3 different pathways between disaster exposure and violence against women. So the first being that being exposed to a disaster increases stressors that trigger violence against women, so mental health, stress, those types of things. Pathway 2 is that it increases enabling environments for violence against women to happen. So we can think of the failure of law enforcement and how that happens post-disaster. And third, it exacerbates underlying drivers of violence against women. So thinking of gender inequalities and how it can augment gender inequalities within societies. Next slide, please. So I wanted to contribute to the literature on natural hazards due to climate change and violence against women with a secondary analysis of global data sets. So this paper was published last year in PLOS Climate, and our analysis draws on data compiled from 363 national representative surveys from 156 countries since 1993. And we merged this intimate partner violence data with climate shock data from the NDAT database, which captures disasters from natural hazards. And we kept earthquakes and volcanoes in our analysis, even though the links to climate change may not be obvious. There is increasing evidence that these are linked to climate change through sea level rise. So our hypotheses were that climate shocks are associated with a higher national prevalence of IPV 2 years following the event. And the 2 years is interesting in this study. And this relationship exists for countries with very different levels of economic development. And we used exploratory factor analysis and structural equation modeling to answer this question. The next slide, please. So our results show that our 8 climate shock variables could be separated into 3 categories. So there was a 3-factor model that was the best fit. The first was geological, representing earthquakes and volcanoes, as I said. The second was hydrometeorological. So this represents floods, landslides, and cyclones or tornadoes, storms. And the third is atmospheric. So wildfires, droughts, and extreme temperatures, so heat waves. And the hydrometeorological variable showed a statistically significant association with intimate partner violence. And this is interesting because it builds on evidence, the wider evidence that supports floods, landslides, and severe storms, and the links to intimate partner violence. But it's also interesting because our analysis doesn't show heat as a factor for intimate partner violence, despite an increasing body of literature that very much supports this. And I'd suggest that this actually has to do with the timeline that some climate shocks have to have an impact on intimate partner violence. So we were looking at how storms, floods, and landslides affected intimate partner violence 2 years after the event. And this shows the longer-term impacts of meteorological events, while heat might actually have more immediate impacts, which are not captured in our analyses. And so this shows the importance of really teasing out these various factors and how they're impacting violence in order to build solutions. Next slide, please. So just to summarize what I've said so far, different climate shocks may have different impacts on intimate partner violence, as we've shown, and this is really important to look at. Interestingly, GDP, so gross domestic product, and climate change had a similar magnitude of effect. But we talk a lot about GDP and low and middle income countries having higher rates of violence, but we don't talk about climate change very much. And so this sort of highlights the importance of the issue and the importance of paying attention to climate change for intimate partner violence. And next slide, please. So I'll go on to the interesting, more contextual stuff. So this is a separate analysis that looked at climate change and its associations on intimate partner violence in Samoa, and it had similar results at the local level. So, but first to give a bit of context, Samoa is a small country located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It has about 200,000 people living primarily on 2 large islands. So Samoa was hit by cyclones in 1990, 91, 2004, and 2012, as well as a tsunami in 2009. But most of the climate shocks experienced by Samoans are actually lesser events that are less significant, including flooding and landslides, which occur quite regularly but are quite localized. Next slide, please. There is some, although not a lot, of research looking at the impacts of climate change on women and violence in Oceania. Most of it is qualitative. However, there's one study from Australia that's provided some data on associations between communities impacted by the Australian bushfires in 2009. It showed that women living in the most severely impacted communities had over 4 times the odds of experiencing intimate partner violence when compared with those from communities that were minimally impacted. So we're beginning to build this quantitative evidence. Next slide, please. To help fill gaps in knowledge from Oceania specifically as one of the regions that it's really, really impacted by climate change at the moment, we did a post hoc analysis of survey data that we had collected from 9 villages across the country. The survey was very much a collaboration between the National University of Samoa, Samoa Victim Support Group, Samoa Bureau of Statistics, and University College London. And our research question was whether an experience of a disaster was associated with intimate partner violence in the past 12 months among women. And to answer this question, we completed a post hoc analysis of data collected from 1,169 people across 9 rural villages. And everyone was asked this question. So in my life, I witnessed or experienced natural events, for example, an earthquake, cyclone, tornado, or flood. Next slide, please. So this table shows our main high-level findings, and I'll break it down for you. So women who had experienced a disaster had more than twice the odds of also experiencing intimate partner violence. This remained mostly the same when adjusting for poor mental health. And women who experienced more disasters had even higher odds. So for instance, women who had experienced 4 or more disasters in their lifetime had over 8 times the odds of also experiencing intimate partner violence. So these make the links very clear within the Samoan context. Next slide, please. So these 2 studies make a number of really important contributions to the literature. First, we've completed one of the first studies in Oceania to quantify associations between natural hazards due to climate change and intimate partner violence. And I think this is critically important for one of the regions most heavily impacted by climate change events. Second, we've shown how climate events have implications for violence against women 2 years after the event. So my experience in Samoa has shown me that this is really only the tip of the iceberg, and that natural disasters have consequences for women and communities far beyond the actual disaster. So 10, 15 years, people are still feeling the consequences of the disaster. And we need to tackle climate change and violence against women together from both sides, as Liz was saying at the beginning. So we need climate mitigation policies that include violence prevention, and we need violence prevention interventions that consider climate change. And we need more research in order to help us enable all of this. Last slide, please. So I left Samoa a few weeks ago with a heavy heart, so I couldn't resist including this final photo. Research is never done alone, and I've been really, really lucky to have an incredible group of collaborators in Samoa. And even though I've left, the work continues, and we have a new study that's looking at the links between climate change and violence in French Polynesia. So watch this space.
Thank you so much, Genevieve, for that very insightful presentation. Please remember to ask your questions in the Q&A chat or the chat box. And I'll now invite Bodaina to also share her presentation with us. Welcome, Bodaina.
Joanna, I was wondering if I could share it from my computer just so I can switch between slides. Is that okay? Or, yeah, I could just
I think
see my
yes,
screen.
that's fine. Yes, we can see it. Go ahead, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I'm delighted to be presenting part of my doctoral research examining the association between drought and the risk of violence, sexual, emotional, and physical against adolescents in Southern Africa. And this work is in collaboration with Dr. Roman Hoffman and my supervisor, Prof. Lucy Kluwer. So just a little bit of a background, the climate crisis is a significant global issue, and droughts are particularly harmful as they negatively impact agriculture, food, and water systems. Southern Africa is especially affected, and this is due to El Niño climatic phenomenon, which causes changes in atmospheric pressure in the region that leads to reduced rainfalls and increased temperatures. Now, as 70% of the Southern African region depends on rain-fed agriculture, this translates to exacerbated poverty, placing immense psychological strain on individuals and communities, fostering conditions of violence perpetration. Against the background of already existing high violence rates against adolescents in this region, this warrants a careful investigation of the climate violence nexus. So we have three problems here that we're hoping to address through the study. And the first being that despite adolescence is considered as an important critical period of development, the victimization impacts on this age group due to climate change remain largely underexplored. The second problem is that while emerging research has focused mainly on the impacts of drought on gender-based violence, almost no quantitative evidence exists on other forms of violence, including emotional and physical. Lastly, the role of gender, age, and rural residents in moderating the association between droughts and the risk of violence remains unknown, so this study aims to fill these gaps. So we have two research objectives here. First, to understand the relationship between drought, exposure, and violence against adolescents in three countries, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Lesotho. And just to clarify, a previous version of this study included Zambia and Namibia, but we ended up removing Zambia because we realized that there was not enough drought variation in the year before the violence has occurred, and similar to Namibia, so we decided to stick with the three countries because they had enough drought variation in the year before violence occurrence. And then the second objective is to determine whether gender, age, rural residents moderate this relationship. So to understand this multifaceted and very complicated relationship between drought and violence exposure, I found this very helpful theory that guided the analysis, and it's the feminist political ecology theory. And it highlights that females' vulnerabilities are differential and distinct, and their roles in environmental change. So it emphasizes not only their roles as affected by environmental change, but as active agents through their roles in agriculture and farming. The theory also highlights that gendered power structures shape how females experience environmental stressors, and this is represented in disparities in labor routines, inaccessibility to climate resilience resources, and inadequate protective services. And lastly, the theory highlights the intersecting social markers, such as age, ethnicity, employment, and geographic location, among other social markers that further influence the vulnerability. And this must be embedded within a broader context of political and economic systems that interact with these social markers to further shape the women's experiences in climate change contexts. So just an overview about the data we're using. We're using the Violence Against Children surveys, which I'm sure a lot of you here are familiar with it, but if you're not, they're cross-sectional national representative household surveys for males and females aged between 13 to 24 years. In this study, we have data from 20,190 participants, both males and females, from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Lesotho. So in terms of our drought measurement, we found a lot of drought indicators that we could use to measure drought. However, we decided to go with the Standard Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, which is a fairly new index that combines the features of previous indicators, such as the PDSI or SPI, while also accounting for the important feature of evapotranspiration, which is very important for an African context due to high temperatures. It also has a multiscalar feature of being able to measure long-term and short-term climate change while being comparable across regions. So these are our variables of interest, the exposure being drought, 3 violence outcomes that we're focusing on. I'm not going to go through the definitions, but an important point to note here is that our violence outcomes, we disaggregated them to non-partner violence forms and intimate partner violence forms. So each of these forms have a non-partner perpetrator and an intimate partner perpetrator, so we can understand the context by which this relationship manifests. And these are our confounding factors. So this is a multi-country cross-sectional study. We did an exploratory data analysis, and as I mentioned, we disaggregated violence forms by perpetrator type. We conducted a series of multivariable logistic regressions to examine the association, applied country fixed effects to control for any differences within countries, and applied robust standard errors at the cluster level. So these are the baseline characteristics of the study sample. These are all weighted frequencies. And as you can see, more than 2/3 of the sample lived in rural areas and informal housing. And also more than 2/3 are enrolled or completed education, which is represented in the education attainment variable. And we have a little bit more females than males and more older adolescents than younger ones. So this graph here, this graph here shows the different prevalences of each violence form disaggregated by perpetrator in each country, stratified by gender. Now, there are some interesting differences here, but for the interest of time, I'm going to skip through this, but happy to go back in the Q&A. So jumping to the first set of results we have here, this is our main logistical regression model showing the relationship between our predictor, which is drought, and the 3 violence forms disaggregated by the perpetrator. And as you can see here, for every unit increase in drought exposure, the risk of violence increases for all violence forms except for the sexual IPV, while controlling for the socio-demographic factors. And this is for the whole sample, so males and females together. So it was only important for us to then conduct a moderation analysis and understand how does this relationship differ according to gender, age, and rural residence. So these are the tables for the moderation analysis, but I know tables aren't the most fun things to look at. So I'm going to skip to the visualization of these results as they could better visualize the results. So the first set of visualizations here, we have the gender moderation analysis. So as you can see, we have the purple is female and the orange or yellow is male. And as you can see, as the severity of drought increases, the risk of experiencing non-partner sexual violence, non-partner emotional violence, and emotional IPV significantly increases for females compared to males. Similarly, we have in the age moderation analysis, purple is the older adolescents from 18 to 24, and younger is the 13 to 17. And there is a similar risk profile to the gender moderation analysis, increasing the risk for non-partner sexual and emotional violence, as well as emotional IPV for older adolescents in comparison to the younger ones. Lastly, we have the residence moderation analysis, which is an rural-urban analysis, and it shows that as you can see here, the purple is rural adolescents living in rural areas, and as you can see, as the drought increases and mainly towards the severe side of the index, is where the lines cross, and that we can see a significant effect of experiencing non-partner physical violence for adolescents living in rural areas. So these are the key takeaways from these results. Now, we saw that drought significantly increases the risk of violence exposure for all adolescents. Compared to boys, girls living in drought settings are at higher risk of violence. 37% for sexual violence, 27% more for non-partner violence, emotional violence, and 44% more for emotional IPV. Older adolescents are more at risk for non-partner sexual and non-partner emotional violence, as well as emotional IPV. Rural residents exacerbates adolescents' risk to non-partner physical violence. So there is a clear need for interdisciplinary programming by integrating climate adaptation measures, social protection, and violence prevention strategies. We need to scale up access to gender-responsive and age-specific climate and violence prevention programming to support adolescents in their households, potentially targeting those in rural areas. There is also a need for more research examining the mechanisms and the actual risk pathways between drought and violence exposure, and this is to inform more evidence-based policies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bothena, for sharing that lovely presentation covering Southern Africa. So we've had from Bothena and from Genevieve from Southern Africa and also from Samoa. And now I'll pass it over to Laura to share with us insights from Colombia, Nigeria, and the Philippines. Over to you, Bothena, and please remember to continue asking your questions in the chat.
Hi everyone. Can you see my slides? Wonderful. Okay, so I'm very happy to be here today and talk to you about the Gender Just Landscapes project. It's a transdisciplinary research project examining GBV in relation to climate and environmental change in the Philippines, Nigeria, and Colombia. So I'm presenting on behalf of a large team of people, including civil society activists and researchers, and GBV specialists and environmental specialists. So I really look forward to questions and feedback as we're still sense-making from the different contexts. So to give you a brief overview of the presentation, I'll situate our research in the literature and describe our research project very briefly, some key findings, and then go into depth by illustrating our key conclusions with a case study from Colombia, and close with some further conclusions. So we contextualize our study in the literature on GBV, climate and environmental change, which broadly, messily, falls into 4 categories. And that's GBV prevalence linked to natural disasters and extreme weather, increases in temperature, climate variability, and also environmental and resource-related conflict, and natural resource exploitation as both a driver of climate change, but also hindering the ability of governments and other stakeholders to respond to climate change. So broadly, the current literature often examines kind of the cause and effect relationship, which is extremely important between climate change and gender-based violence. But this, at the same time, may underestimate its complexity and pervasiveness and impact. So it focuses on the immediate conditions, such as the climate event. But however, our engagements through this research found that a lot of these issues, the type of GBV and the type of climate event and environmental change, they often overlapped and exacerbated each other. And this highlighted the very slow nature of violence over time that Geneviève mentioned, but also these discussions highlighted the root causes of violence. We also found significant evidence in each of the contexts we work in of women's resilience, resistance, and movement building, which is often not reflected in literature. So very quickly speaking, we used a different methodology in each of the contexts, but it was really an open-ended case study inquiry. So we invited discussions with primarily women using the climate event. So in the case of Colombia, it was a flood, to engage with women in discussions about violence. And this often led to very different places in discussion, different findings. So this was primarily a qualitative and participatory action approach, but we also used arts-based methods as a way to engage with women in a trauma-informed and sensitive way. So in that way, we used illustration, we used photography, we used mapping in the Philippines, and somatic practice, so talking while walking in Colombia, as you'll see. And similar to the former presentations, the lens we used was feminist political ecology and economy. So from each of the sites are broad conclusions. So what did we learn about risk and women's agency? So we found that women and girls experience very specific and diverse forms of violence, ranging from IPV to structural violence. And in every case study country, women related this violence, the interpersonal violence, to structural violence, to deep inequality that's taken place over time, that increased risk of exploitation with its roots in environmental degradation, capitalism, and colonialism. Second, we also found that violence and oppression was embedded within different sets of social relations and territories, and they played out in the everyday activities of women, but also in broader processes of food and natural resource governments, as well as in emergency response to events. Also, to justify violence and control natural resources, women identity and labor, particularly in agriculture, was racialized and devalued over time, and thoroughly not supported during climate emergencies as well. But interwoven in these experiences were very important forms of resistance and agency, and very importantly, it was connecting the dots between gender-based violence, climate, and environmental change when other organizations were not. Okay, so now I'll start to present the case study, and just to the two lovely people in the corner there are Diana and Juliana, and they led the research in Macoa, Putumayo in Colombia. So I am grateful to them that I can present on their behalf. So they began the engagement based around the 2017 flood. A flood in Putumayo, and these are increasing in prevalence and are related to changing climate patterns. And currently, they are in the midst of experiencing another one. So they walked and talked with 16 women survivors and activists and shared stories during a forest walk. The women took different roles in the process: photography, storytellers, collecting parts of nature, and to create their individual and collective narratives about the situation in their community. Okay, so the event that we began the discussion with on March 31st was floods and an avalanche that killed over 200 people. And this event was linked to climate change and deforestation that's happening in the area. So fatalities were highest for those who lived along the riverbank, obviously, but that is where people who were poor lived. So displaced people, female-headed households, indigenous and Afro descendants, and they lived in temporary structures, so very vulnerable to floods. Women described sexual harassment and abuse in shelters following the flood. And one of the participants uncovered during investigations after the flood that at least 7 children disappeared from a shelter after the flood. Violence in families and communities also was worsened after the event, related to stress and hopelessness because of the lack of food, clean water, and jobs. So in discussion with women, they kind of selected the word or the phrase desborde, referring to the overflow of water, which was a literal and metaphorical translation of how they were struggling with violence in their lives, related to this event, but much beyond. So this flood of feelings. So they felt that this flood represented violence of nature in a retaliation against environmental exploitation and degradation by exploitive industries over time. They also said that it was related to the violence they feel in their homes and communities due to men's overflow of emotions based on their anger and frustration with their situation. It also represented the violence in and on their bodies due to stress, emotional, and physical labor that they've had to deal with as a result. Finally, it also represented the violence against communities and against nature related to large-scale mining and deforestation and lack of government support in the area. Just to pick up on that last point is that women very much felt violated by the government support, government response after the floods. They said that there was uneven, inequitable reconstruction, and that growing inequality that was as a result of these many years of flooding and conflicts was fueling violence at many different levels. But the solution from the government was to build a large dam along this riverbank to mitigate floods. So this was constructed, obviously taking millions of dollars from the community, instead of the option that women and environmental activists were advocating for, which was the creation of a green corridor in the area along the riverside that would be both the climate adaptation method, so soaking up the water, providing a barrier for the floods, preventing the floods affecting communities, and also a mitigation strategy. So women very much felt that this investment took away from what was really needed, which was help and support to rebuild the social fabric of communities, which would prevent violence. So that's articulated in the quote on the side there. When we talk about reconstruction, we talk about brick, cement, houses, and bridges, but we don't talk about the human fabric. So further, women express their increasing responsibility of addressing these ruptured social fabrics in the absence of any government support or other support. And women and women's organizations had to fill this gap. And this was contributing to heightened emotional and care labor. At the same time, women's roles and their alternative practices, such as agroecological farming and supportive nature replenishment, were often vilified in racist tropes. And I don't have time to go through the quotes, but I hope you have time to read them. So at the same time, women's organizations from various sectors, from gender-based violence sector, from human rights and environmental sectors, were together collectively addressing these interconnected forms of violence. So for example, in gender-based violence-related organizations, they were not only undertaking their core mandate of responding to supporting survivors, but also providing emergency response, support for women to reconstruct their homes with very few resources. There was also a broader movement of resistance and organization and protest against extractive industries and deforestation against the private sector, which really was bringing together a diverse array of women's organizations. So just to conclude here, to bring back to some conclusions from the different sites, and I'm sorry I couldn't do justice to the other locations, but happy to talk about it to anyone or link you with people. But in conclusion, we found that these interconnected forms of violence are very much existing contexts where climate and environmental issues and social unrest are growing. So it really troubles our notions of GBV risk related to climate and the environment. So it's not only occurring when maybe women are traveling further to collect water. It's taking place in all sorts of scenarios. This makes it difficult to translate into prevention and response, and it's not necessarily addressed through infrastructure and quotas of women's representation alone, which is very typical of the environmental sector. However, drawing on the power of emotional connections made through shared experience and shared labor, we really see that women are actively involved in creating alternatives and community responses that are connecting the dots between these issues. So we have a lot to learn from these experiences and collective responses in different spatial landscapes. But it really needs to be interfaced and joined up with GBV-focused organizations, environmental and agricultural organizations, and decision makers, which currently I don't feel is done quite yet. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura and Genevieve and Botaina for those presentations. It's a very important topic, and the research that you shared with us is very useful for advancing knowledge on this area. So we have just about 5 minutes left. So we have quite a number of questions that have come in through the chat, but we have, I think, one question that is not yet answered. And this question is around carbon reduction, carbon markets. A participant who encountered a project on carbon markets, and one of the objectives was to reduce violence against women in the communities. And this participant is asking for any panelist take on the role of carbon market projects in reducing violence against women. So I'll pass it on to any panelist who feels comfortable answering that. And also there's been a request for resources on climate shock and GBV training and resources regarding to that. So if you can also share that in the chat, but also share them with us so that when we are sharing the resources, we can also include those. Over to any of the panelists. I'm not sure who would want to take that, the carbon markets and reducing violence against women. Okay. All right. I think maybe that is something that maybe we can share resources. Sorry, Liz, do you want to come in?
Yeah, and then maybe this is not sort of something that the panelists feel comfortable responding to, but we really appreciate the question. And if the person that asked the question has some information on that, we'd be super interested to hearing about that. So do share with us at svri@svri.org. So back to you, Joanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So please feel free to also share any other questions that you may have and request for linkages to the presenters, etc. And I'll pass it over to Liesl to share the closing remarks. And it's been a pleasure moderating this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Joanne. Thank you so much for joining us today and for being part of this journey through the Voices from SVRI 2024 series. Each webinar in the series has reflected the depth, complexity, and humanity of our field, from technology-facilitated gender-based violence to economic empowerment, the intersections of intimate partner violence and violence against children, and today's timely discussion on climate change and violence against women. A heartfelt thank you to today's facilitator, Joanne, and our speakers, Liz, Genevieve, Botaina, and Laura. Your generosity in sharing knowledge and experience helps us all think and act more boldly, more carefully, and more connectedly. And to all of you who've attended and engaged throughout this series, thank you for the questions, the ideas, and your solidarity. We are especially grateful to the Australian Volunteers Program, whose generous co-funding made the series possible, and who will also be supporting Part 2, which launches very soon. We're excited to announce that this new series will take us towards SVRI Forum 2026, with 2 launch webinars across time zones and 2 topical sessions looking ahead to what's next in our field. Dates, themes, and speakers will be shared soon via SVRI social media and our weekly update, so please do stay connected. And of course, we invite you to join us in person at the Forum in Bangkok 2026, 5 to 9 October. Let's keep building this community together, and thank you very much for joining. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.